The avoidant walks away from the relationship convinced they have escaped pressure, believing they have restored defended comfort, certain they will find someone else who wants less, or will simply remain contentedly alone. They tell themselves they feel relief, that your absence removes obligations they could not sustain, that their life improves without relationship demands they experienced as suffocating. The avoidant maintains this comfortable narrative for days, weeks, perhaps months, reassuring themselves they made the right choice, that their patterns were justified, that they are better off without connection that required more than they could provide. Yet beneath this defended surface, forces are building that will eventually overwhelm the avoidant's resistance to return. These forces operate outside the avoidant's conscious control, emerging from psychological mechanisms their defensive structure cannot prevent or manage. The avoidant begins noticing that no subsequent connection replicates what you offered, that their defended isolation feels increasingly empty rather than peaceful, that they compare everyone to you and find them lacking. Your genuine indifference, if you have achieved it, eliminates every defensive strategy the avoidant typically employs to maintain distance. Your visible thriving creates constant reminder that they lost someone remarkable who is flourishing without them. The accumulation of failed relationships following the same pattern forces recognition they are the common problem. Time reveals that the qualities you possessed are not easily found elsewhere, that your patience and understanding were rare gifts they took for granted. Eventually, the weight of these forces becomes unbearable. The avoidant faces that their defended position has cost them someone irreplaceable, that their patterns have destroyed their best opportunity for intimate connection, that the isolation they chose feels more painful than the vulnerability they avoided. This recognition, combined with the psychological pressure of watching you thrive, of encountering your indifference, of failing to find anyone who compares to you, creates crisis where the avoidant has no choice but to attempt return. They reach out, not because they have genuinely transformed, but because the alternative, accepting permanent loss of you, has become more unbearable than the vulnerability that reaching out requires. Yet, this inevitable return means nothing for your well-being unless you have fundamentally transformed yourself, unless you have built life that no longer needs their presence, unless you have developed capacity to receive their return with the indifference that forces them to finally do the real work of change, or to face that they have lost you permanently. When you master indifference, they lose all defensive ground. The avoidant's entire defensive system operates by managing others' emotional investment in them, by using that investment as lever to maintain control, by relying on others' continued caring to ensure their patterns generate no permanent consequences. Throughout the relationship, the avoidant wielded power through your emotional reactivity. Your hurt when they withdrew validated their impact. Your relief when they returned confirmed their importance. Your frustration with their patterns proved you remained invested. Every emotion you displayed toward them, whether positive or negative, provided the avoidant with information about their power over you, with confirmation that they mattered significantly to you, with evidence that their presence or absence affected you deeply. This emotional investment from you gave the avoidant psychological foundation to maintain their defended position, because they knew unconsciously that someone cared enough to keep pursuing, to keep hoping, to keep working to maintain connection. They refused to reciprocate adequately. When you achieve genuine indifference toward the avoidant, when you reach internal state where their behavior generates no emotional response in you, when you can observe their patterns with the neutrality you might feel toward a stranger's choices, you eliminate every defensive mechanism the avoidant has relied upon to maintain distance while keeping you engaged. The avoidant cannot use your hurt to confirm their impact because you no longer feel hurt by their withdrawal. You feel nothing. They cannot rely on your relief when they return, because you experience no relief. You remain neutral whether they are present or absent. They cannot point to your frustration as evidence that you want too much because you no longer feel frustrated. You have accepted them exactly as they are, while accepting that who they are cannot meet your needs. This mastered indifference operates entirely differently from performed coldness or strategic distance. When you perform indifference while remaining emotionally invested, the avoidant senses the performance beneath the surface and recognizes that your emotional investment persists despite your cool exterior. This recognition actually provides the avoidant with comfort because it confirms they still matter to you, that they retain power to affect you, that your defended presentation masks continued caring. Genuine indifference carries no such hidden investment. You are not performing neutrality while suppressing feelings. You have actually reached internal state where the avoidant no longer generates significant emotion in you, where their choices feel as relevant to your well-being as choices made by people you have never met, where you genuinely do not care whether they return or remain permanently absent. The avoidant experiences this genuine indifference as complete loss of the relational ground their defensive system requires to operate. The avoidance patterns throughout the relationship assumed you would remain emotionally engaged, hurt by their distance, hopeful about their potential, frustrated by their limitations, relieved by their occasional presence. These emotional responses, while uncomfortable for you, actually serve the avoidant's defensive needs by confirming their significance and by providing psychological material they could work with through their familiar defensive maneuvers. Your genuine indifference eliminates all this material. The avoidant has nothing to work with, no emotional investment to leverage, no reactions to manage or manipulate. They face that they have become genuinely irrelevant to your emotional landscape rather than remaining significant even negatively. This complete loss of defensive ground creates profound crisis for the avoidant because their self-concept has incorporated belief that they matter intensely to people who have been close to them, that their presence or absence generates strong feeling, that they have lasting impact even when relationships end. Your genuine indifference destroys this belief. The avoidant must face that someone who knew them intimately, who invested significantly in them, who understood their patterns deeply, has concluded that they are simply not worth continued emotional investment of any kind. This recognition that they have been evaluated and found not just wanting, but actually unworthy of continued care, penetrates the avoidant's defended ego in ways that anger or hurt never could, because anger and hurt still communicate significance. The mastered indifference also eliminates the avoidant's ability to reactivate your investment through the tactics that worked throughout the relationship. The avoidant cannot use sudden vulnerability to soften you because you receive their vulnerability with polite neutrality that carries no warmth or investment. They cannot employ promises of change to restore your hope because you respond to their promises with the same skepticism and disinterest they showed toward your needs. They cannot create drama or crisis to pull you back into emotional engagement because you maintain boundaries with calm firmness that demonstrates their attempts to generate your emotion are failing completely. The avoidant discovers that all their usual methods for managing others' investment no longer function because you have no investment left to manage. Your indifference forces the avoidant to confront that they must actually change rather than simply performing change temporarily to restore your investment. Throughout the relationship, the avoidant could offer minimal adjustments to their behavior, knowing that small gestures would generate your enthusiasm and renewed hope, allowing them to return to defended patterns once they had secured your continued engagement. Your indifference eliminates this possibility. The avoidant recognizes that temporary performance will not penetrate your neutral boundaries, that promises without sustained demonstration mean nothing to you, that they cannot simply charm or manipulate their way back into your life. If the avoidant wants connection with you, they must develop actual capacity for intimacy, rather than offering the surface-level adjustments that previously satisfied you. Understanding that your mastered indifference eliminates the avoidant's defensive ground requires recognizing that this indifference must be authentic internal state rather than strategic presentation. You cannot fake the quality of energy that genuine indifference carries. The avoidant will sense if you are suppressing feelings, will recognize if you remain hurt or angry beneath calm exterior, will detect if your neutrality serves as defense rather than reflecting actual lack of investment. Mastering indifference requires completing genuine internal work of releasing them, grieving the loss, accepting their limitations, choosing yourself so completely that whether they return or not becomes genuinely irrelevant to your well-being. Only this authentic indifference eliminates all the avoidance defensive ground by demonstrating that you have moved so far beyond them that their patterns no longer affect you in any way. Your thriving becomes psychological torture they cannot escape. The avoidant maintains comfortable defended position partly through unconscious assumption that their absence creates some visible diminishment in your life, that losing them costs you something significant, that your well-being suffers from their unavailability. This assumption protects the avoidant's ego by confirming their importance. If you struggle without them, they matter. If you appear diminished by their absence, they were valuable. If your life seems less satisfying without them, they were contributing something significant despite their patterns. The avoidant may not consciously articulate these assumptions, but they operate beneath defended awareness, providing psychological comfort that allows the avoidant to maintain distance without confronting that their defended position might cost them someone who enhances their life more than they enhance yours. When you not only survive without the avoidant, but actively thrive in ways that clearly exceed your state during the relationship, you destroy every assumption that protected the avoidant's defended comfort. Your thriving becomes undeniable evidence that appears whenever the avoidant encounters information about your life, that forces itself into the avoidant's awareness through mutual connections or through observation of your activities, that the avoidant cannot avoid or dismiss because your improved state is visible and obviously genuine. The avoidant sees you laughing more freely than you did with them, engaging more deeply with life than when you were depleting yourself trying to maintain connection with someone emotionally unavailable, radiating confidence and contentment that contrasts sharply with the anxiety and exhaustion you carried during the relationship. This visible thriving creates psychological torture for the avoidant because it operates as constant reminder that penetrates whatever defenses they attempt to maintain. The avoidant cannot tell themselves you were too needy when you clearly possess profound self-sufficiency. They cannot characterize you as unable to handle their complexity when you appear happier without that complexity in your life. They cannot maintain that the relationship failed due to your limitations when your thriving suggests you are flourishing precisely because you are no longer constrained by relationship with someone whose patterns prevented mutual flourishing. Every defensive narrative the avoidant constructed to justify their patterns collapses when confronted with evidence that you are better off without them. Your thriving also forces the avoidant to recognize that their presence in your life was net negative rather than net positive. The visible contrast between your depleted state during the relationship and your vibrant state after it ends tells story the avoidant cannot misinterpret. You are sacrificing your own well-being to accommodate their limitations. You are suppressing your vitality to manage their defensive needs. You are accepting less than you deserved in hopes they would eventually develop capacity they consistently demonstrated they lacked. The avoidant must face that they were not contributing to your happiness, but rather preventing it. That their defended position was not neutral presence in your life, but actively harmful force that your removal of that force has allowed you to heal from and transcend. The torture intensifies as the avoidant recognizes they are watching you give your best self to life or to someone else, rather than continuing to deplete yourself trying to connect with them. The avoidant sees you demonstrating qualities, joy, openness, engagement, vitality that you rarely showed during the relationship because their patterns kept you in constant state of managing disappointment and hoping for change. The avoidant faces that these qualities existed within you all along, but you could not access them, while investing your energy in someone who could not reciprocate adequately. This recognition generates a particular form of regret, because the avoidant understands that they had access to a remarkable person whose remarkable qualities they never fully experienced, because their defensive limitations prevented you from flourishing while in relationship with them. Your thriving becomes inescapable psychological presence, because the avoidant carries it with them even when not directly observing you. The avoidant thinks about how you looked when they last saw you, remembers evidence of your happiness that contradicted their assumptions about your struggle, compares their own defended isolation to your obvious fulfillment. These thoughts arrive unbidden, penetrating the avoidant's defended consciousness during moments when their defense is lower, creating persistent awareness that someone they pushed away is thriving in their absence, in ways that expose the avoidant's patterns as destructive rather than protective. The avoidant cannot escape this awareness, because your thriving has become a permanent reference point that all their current experiences get measured against. The psychological torture also emerges from the avoidant recognizing that time is making the disparity between your trajectories increasingly stark. While you move forward into expansion, building satisfying life, developing meaningful connections, demonstrating increasing confidence and joy, the avoidant remains stuck in defended patterns that create the same relational failures repeatedly. The avoidant watches the distance between your life trajectory and theirs grow wider with each passing month, sees you moving toward fulfillment while they cycle through the same defended isolation, recognizes that your choice to leave them was not mistake, but rather was wise decision that allowed you to access well-being that relationship with them prevented. Your thriving particularly tortures the avoidant when they observe you apparently happy with someone new who can provide the consistent presence they could not offer. The avoidant faces concrete evidence that you can inspire adequate investment and reciprocation from someone less defended, that your needs were not excessive but simply could not be met by someone with their limitations, that you possess capacity for healthy mutual relationship that their defensive structure prevented them from participating in. This observation destroys the avoidant's defensive narrative that you wanted too much by proving that someone else can provide what you needed without apparent difficulty, suggesting the problem was never your needs, but rather the avoidant's incapacity. Understanding why your thriving becomes inescapable psychological torture requires recognizing that the avoidant's defensive comfort depends on maintaining certain beliefs about their importance and about the reasonableness of their patterns. Your thriving destroys all these beliefs by demonstrating that you neither needed them nor were diminished by their absence, that your life improves rather than deteriorates without them, that their defensive position was harming rather than protecting you. The avoidant carries awareness of your thriving as constant counter-evidence to every defensive narrative they attempt to construct, creating psychological pressure that intensifies over time as the contrast between your expansion and their stagnation becomes increasingly undeniable. This pressure eventually becomes unbearable, forcing the avoidant toward crisis where they must either examine their patterns or continue defending against reality that your thriving makes impossible to ignore. They cannot replicate what you offered anywhere else. The avoidant moves forward after the relationship ends with unconscious assumption that they will find someone else who provides what you provided, but with less pressure, less need for emotional availability, less expectation of consistent presence. The avoidant believes that the specific qualities you possessed, your patience, your understanding, your capacity to see beneath their defenses, your willingness to accommodate their patterns, are not unique to you, but rather are available in others, who will accept the avoidant's limitations more readily than you eventually did. This assumption allows the avoidant to maintain defended position without anxiety about having lost someone irreplaceable, to continue patterns without confronting that those patterns destroyed connection with person whose particular combination of qualities they may never encounter again. The avoidant enters new connections carrying unconscious template of what you provided, measuring every new person against standards you established through your specific qualities and your particular way of relating to them. Each new person encounters this invisible comparison and fails to measure up in ways the avoidant initially dismisses as minor differences, but gradually recognizes as fundamental gaps. The avoidant discovers that new people lack your specific capacity to understand their defensive patterns. They do not intuitively recognize when the avoidant needs space, do not remain steady when the avoidant withdraws, do not interpret the avoidant's defended behavior with the sophisticated psychological awareness you developed across time spent learning their rhythms and understanding their wounds. New connections also lack your particular patience that allowed the avoidant to maintain defended position without immediate consequences. You tolerated the avoidant's withdrawal patterns for extended periods, gave them space without taking the distance personally, maintained a warm presence despite their inconsistent availability. The avoidant discovers that others establish boundaries more quickly, express frustration sooner, refuse to tolerate emotional unavailability for as long as you did. What the avoidant experienced as your excessive patience or inappropriate accommodation now reveals itself as extraordinary capacity most people do not possess. The avoidant faces that your tolerance, which they took for granted while receiving it, was unusual gift rather than standard offering they can expect from others. The avoidant particularly cannot replicate the specific quality of care you provided, care that communicated through consistent small actions that you noticed their needs, remembered their preferences, invested energy in understanding them deeply. New connections lack the accumulated knowledge you developed about what comforted them, what triggered their defenses, what helped them feel safe enough to briefly lower their walls. The avoidant realizes that developing this level of understanding requires time and sustained attention that their patterns prevent, because they withdraw before connections can deepen to the point where such understanding develops. The avoidant faces catch-22. They need someone with your level of understanding to feel safe enough to maintain connection. Yet developing that understanding requires sustained connection. Their defenses prevent them from providing. The avoidant also discovers that the combination of qualities you possessed rarely exists in single person. The avoidant might encounter someone patient like you, but lacking your emotional intelligence. Might find someone understanding, but without your capacity to maintain boundaries. Might meet someone who sees through their defenses, but responds with pressure rather than your spacious acceptance. The specific constellation of qualities you embodied, patience combined with boundaries, understanding combined with self-respect, acceptance combined with clear communication of needs, represents rare synthesis that the avoidant only recognizes as rare after encountering many people who possess some, but not all of these qualities. The irreplaceability becomes particularly apparent when the avoidant recognizes that you knew them in ways that new people cannot quickly replicate. You witnessed the avoidant across various contexts and circumstances, understood their patterns intimately, recognized the fears beneath their defended presentation. This depth of knowing created foundation where the avoidant could occasionally risk vulnerability because you had demonstrated through sustained interaction that you would not weaponize that knowledge against them. New connections lack this foundation of trust built across time, meaning the avoidant must either risk vulnerability with people who have not earned that trust or maintain defended position that prevents anyone from knowing them as deeply as you did. The avoidant faces that what you offered was not simply a set of behaviors they can find replicated elsewhere, but rather was relational dynamic that emerged from who you are as person interacting with who they are across sustained time. The specific way you responded to their withdrawal, the particular manner in which you gave space while maintaining presence, the unique quality of understanding you brought to interpreting their patterns, all of these reflected your individual psychological makeup and your specific way of relating, rather than being generic responses any patient person could provide. The avoidant recognizes that they are not searching for someone with your qualities, but rather are searching for you specifically, that what they lost was not replaceable because it was not generic, but rather was specific to the relational chemistry between you. The irreplaceability also extends to what the relationship provided beyond your individual qualities. The avoidant and you developed specific ways of being together, accumulated shared experiences that created private understanding, built relational history that gave interactions depth and context. New connections start from zero, lacking all this accumulated foundation. The avoidant discovers that starting over means explaining themselves again, teaching someone new to understand their patterns, building trust from beginning when they had trust with you that developed across sustained connection. This recognition that replacing you means not just finding someone with your qualities, but also investing years to develop equivalent depth of knowing creates exhaustion that makes the prospect of truly replacing you feel impossible. Understanding why the avoidant cannot replicate what you offered requires recognizing that human beings are not interchangeable, that the specific qualities someone brings to relationship combine with relational history and individual chemistry to create something that cannot be easily reproduced elsewhere. The avoidant's assumption that they can find someone like you reveals their defensive need to minimize your significance, to avoid confronting that they lost someone unique. Yet as the avoidant cycles through subsequent connections that fail to provide what you provided, as they recognize that no one combines your qualities in the same way, as they face that the depth of understanding you developed cannot be quickly recreated, they must acknowledge that you were not replaceable variable in equation, but rather were a specific person whose loss represents permanent, rather than temporary gap in their life. This recognition creates psychological pressure that contributes to their eventual inevitable return. The collapse happens when all their patterns fail simultaneously. The avoidant maintains defended position through life by ensuring that not all their defensive strategies fail at the same time, by keeping enough working mechanisms in their psychological structure that they can avoid confronting the fundamental dysfunction of their defensive approach to relationships. The avoidant tells themselves that relationships fail due to specific circumstances or incompatible partners, rather than due to their consistent patterns. The avoidant maintains belief that they could be happy in defended isolation by avoiding full experience of that isolation's costs. The avoidant convinces themselves their patterns are justified by selectively attending to evidence that confirms this belief while ignoring contradictory evidence. These defensive mechanisms operate in rotation, each one catching the avoidant before they fall into full recognition of their pattern's costs, each one providing just enough protection that the avoidant can continue their defended life without facing crisis that would force examination of the defensive structure itself. Yet when you have genuinely moved on, when you demonstrate authentic indifference, when you visibly thrive without them, when they cannot replicate what you offered anywhere else, and when time passes, revealing these conditions as permanent rather than temporary, all the avoidance defensive mechanisms fail simultaneously. The avoidant can no longer tell themselves that specific relationship failed due to circumstances because they see pattern across multiple relationships where their defensive withdrawal creates identical outcome. They cannot maintain comfortable defended isolation because your thriving creates constant psychological presence that makes their isolation feel empty rather than peaceful. They cannot minimize your importance because their inability to find anyone comparable forces recognition that you were irreplaceable. They cannot avoid accountability for their patterns because your indifference eliminates the usual targets for blame. You are not hurt or angry, not pursuing or demanding, not available to be characterized as the problem. This simultaneous failure of all defensive mechanisms creates psychological collapse where the avoidant can no longer maintain their defended self-concept. The beliefs that have organized their relational life, that their patterns are justified, that others want too much, that they are better off alone, that they can find someone more compatible, all crumble under weight of accumulated evidence that these beliefs are defensive rationalizations rather than accurate assessments. The avoidant faces that their patterns have destroyed their best opportunity for intimate connection, that their defended position has cost them someone remarkable they will likely never encounter again, that their isolation stems from their own limitations rather than from others' inadequacy. The collapse intensifies as the avoidant recognizes that they have been lying to themselves about fundamental aspects of their emotional life. The avoidant faces that they claim not to need intimate connection, yet they feel profound loneliness, that they presented their distance as preference, yet they miss you constantly, that they characterized their patterns as healthy boundaries. Yet those patterns have created exactly the isolation and loss they organized their life around preventing. These recognitions that their defensive narratives were false, that they have been deceiving themselves about what they actually want and need, that their entire relational approach has been based on lies they told themselves to avoid confronting their fear. All of this arrives with devastating force when defensive mechanisms fail simultaneously rather than in rotation that would allow one mechanism to catch them before full recognition occurs.